Slavery is one of history's darkest institutions, a system that shaped nations, fueled economies, and left scars that still linger today. But before slavery became the industrialized, generational cycle we recognize in the American colonies, it had long existed in other forms. American slavery did not begin in 1619, it began long before, in Africa, where systems of servitude operated under vastly different structures. Tonight, we delve deep into the foundations of enslavement, the truth behind how slavery was transformed into the brutal institution that shaped America. If you find these history videos immersive and engaging, subscribe to the channel and let history guide you into the quiet of the night. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. We love seeing how far history reaches. Long before European ships reached African shores, slavery was already a reality in many societies across the continent. However, African slavery differed greatly from what would come to be known as chattel slavery, the system of human ownership that would become embedded in the economies of the Americas. In African societies, slavery often functioned as a form of labor servitude rather than a permanent, generational caste. Many enslaved individuals were captives taken during warfare, debtors repaying obligations, or criminals sentenced to servitude rather than execution. In numerous African regions, enslaved people could integrate into society, marry, earn freedom, or even hold positions of influence. They were not always regarded as purely expendable property. Their status was fluid, shaped by social and economic factors. European traders changed that. When Portuguese and Spanish ships first arrived in West Africa in the 15th century, they sought gold, spices, and trade routes, but they soon turned their attention to human cargo. The demand for plantation labor in European colonies surged, and as economic interests intensified, African slavery became a tool of mass exploitation rather than a localized institution. Coastal African kingdoms, enticed by weapons and goods, facilitated the trade, selling war captives and criminals to European buyers. The scale of slavery expanded beyond previous limits, transforming human bondage from a social condition to an international market. The enslaved were now commodities, their futures rewritten by the weight of European expansion. The English were slower to adopt large-scale participation in the transatlantic slave trade, but by the early 1600s, their colonies in the New World were struggling to maintain labor forces. Tobacco fields in Virginia demanded workers and indentured servitude. The practice of hiring laborers for fixed contracts was proving unreliable. English colonists looked to the thriving slave markets of the Spanish and Portuguese territories, seeing an opportunity to stabilize their own colonial economies. Then, in 1619, the moment arrived. A Dutch privateer ship, the White Lion, sailed into Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying enslaved Africans. They had been stolen from a Portuguese slave ship, redirected from their original fate. Yet their presence in the English colony marked a turning point. The Africans were traded in exchange for supplies, their fate left to English colonial leaders who had yet to establish formal slave laws. These first Africans in Virginia were not immediately reduced to the hereditary slavery that would later define the American South. Some were treated as indentured servants, earning eventual freedom. But their arrival set a precedent, one that would soon expand, deepen, and irrevocably shape the colony's future. Within decades, laws solidified slavery as a lifelong condition, stripping Africans of legal rights, ensuring their servitude passed down through generations, and cementing the racial hierarchy that would dictate the future of American society. What began in Africa as a system of servitude had now become something entirely different. A brutal, industrialized enterprise one designed to never end. And with that transformation, the seeds of American slavery had been planted. The arrival of the first enslaved Africans in Virginia had set the foundation for an institution that would expand, evolve, and become one of the defining structures of American society. Though some of the first Africans were granted freedom after years of labor, the gradual codification of race-based slavery ensured that future generations would never see such opportunities. By the mid-1600s, slavery in the colonies had taken a more permanent form. Legal distinctions between white indentured servants and enslaved Africans were deepening. Laws explicitly prohibited enslaved people from gaining freedom, tying them and their descendants to a lifetime of servitude. The shift was gradual but deliberate. A system that once mirrored forms of servitude seen in parts of Africa had now become something irreversible. English colonial leaders saw the economic benefits of slavery. Unpaid labor meant vast profits. With tobacco plantations demanding endless workforces, colonists found the solution in the expansion of slavery. No longer were enslaved Africans seen as temporary laborers. They were now property. Their status passed from parent to child, their bodies controlled by laws written to ensure they would never escape. The numbers grew. By the late 1600s, thousands of enslaved Africans were being shipped across the Atlantic, arriving in chains. Forced into backbreaking labor under conditions few could survive. Their lives were dictated not only by plantation owners, but by systems designed to strip them of autonomy, language, and even identity. Slavery had become a cornerstone of the American economy, but more than that, it had become irrevocable, institutionalized, and defended by those in power. And from this foundation, the brutal system would only expand further. Indentured servitude and racial slavery were two distinct systems that coexisted in the early years of American colonization, but one was a temporary condition, and the other was designed to last forever. In the early 1600s, before slavery had fully taken hold as the dominant labor system, most laborers on colonial plantations were indentured servants. Men and women, often from England, who had signed contracts agreeing to work for a set number of years in exchange for passage to the New World, food, and shelter. These agreements typically lasted 4 to 7 years, after which the servant would be granted freedom, sometimes along with land or other compensation. It was a harsh system. Many indentured servants were treated brutally, starved, beaten, and worked to exhaustion. But there was always the promise that one day they would be free. Africans who arrived in Virginia in 1619 were not immediately treated as slaves for life. Some were put into indentured servitude, similar to poor European laborers. Historical records show that a handful of these early Africans managed to secure freedom after years of labor, and even owned land themselves. But as the colonies expanded and plantation owners sought a more permanent labor force, the distinction between indentured servitude and racial slavery hardened. The key difference was freedom. White indentured servants had a legal path to liberty, even if their years of servitude were brutal. Enslaved Africans did not. Over time, colonial leaders began rewriting laws to ensure that Africans, and later all black people, would be permanently bound to slavery, with no chance of freedom, not for them, not for their children, not for generations to come. By the mid to late 1600s, the shift had been completed. White servitude remained temporary. Black servitude became permanent. The laws ensured it, and society reinforced it, embedding race-based slavery into the very foundation of American life. This legal transformation did not happen overnight. It was systematically built over decades, with laws gradually stripping Africans and their descendants of any rights, any chance for escape, any recognition as full human beings. The legal codification of slavery ensured that blackness itself was now synonymous with servitude, setting the precedent for centuries of oppression. As the colonies expanded, their economies became increasingly dependent on enslaved labor, particularly in the South, where vast plantations demanded a permanent and reliable workforce. But for slavery to sustain itself as an institution, it needed more than just practice. It needed law. And so, across the late 17th and early 18th centuries, colonial governments crafted legal codes that entrenched racial slavery as an inescapable condition, ensuring that blackness itself became synonymous with servitude. Early English colonists had no explicit framework defining African servitude as lifelong slavery. Initially, enslaved Africans occupied a legal grey area. Some were treated like indentured servants, eventually earning freedom, while others were forced into permanent bondage. But as demand for enslaved labor increased, colonists recognized that granting freedom weakened the system. Wealthy landowners lobbied for legal measures to cement enslavement as a racial destiny rather than a circumstantial condition. Virginia led the way in 1662. The colony passed a landmark law that tied enslavement to race, declaring that any child born to an enslaved woman would inherit her status, ensuring that the institution would perpetuate for generations. This was a critical transformation. Previously, slavery had existed as an individual condition, often dictated by war, debt, or crime. Now it was hereditary, passed from parent to child, binding entire bloodlines to servitude. Other colonies followed. By the early 1700s, laws explicitly defined blackness as equivalent to enslavement. Virginia's 1705 law codified the absolute ownership of enslaved people as property, stripping them of any legal identity beyond labor assets. South Carolina and Maryland wrote similar statutes, ensuring that black individuals had no legal standing beyond their designation as slaves. Even those who were freed faced new restrictions. Laws prevented black people from owning land, testifying in court, or marrying white citizens. Freedom itself was tightly controlled, making escape from slavery nearly impossible in practice. These laws ensured that the system would not be easily undone. The legal infrastructure of racial slavery had been fully established, transforming enslavement into more than just forced labor. It had become a legal status inherited at birth, ensuring that generations of Africans and their descendants would remain trapped within the institution. And with hereditary slavery laws firmly in place, the path toward an entrenched racial hierarchy was set. There was no turning back. The children of slaves would be slaves themselves, marking the final transformation of American slavery into an industrialized, generational cycle that would shape the country's future. Once slavery had been legally defined as a permanent condition tied to race, colonial leaders ensured that the institution would never run out of labor. Laws were crafted not just to hold existing enslaved individuals in bondage, but to make certain that their children and their children's children would inherit their status. This meant that enslaved Africans no longer lived as isolated victims of servitude. They were now part of a generational cycle of enslavement, one from which no escape was possible. The 1662 Virginia law was one of the most significant milestones in this transformation. It established that a child born to an enslaved mother would inherit her enslaved status, regardless of the father's identity. This law had devastating implications. Previously, mixed-race children sometimes had the opportunity to earn freedom. But now, slavery was woven into bloodlines, ensuring that every new generation remained trapped under its weight. This principle became the backbone of American slavery. It stripped enslaved individuals of any hope of eventual release and guaranteed that slave owners would never lack for new laborers. No longer did plantation owners need to rely solely on the Atlantic slave trade to replenish their workforces. Now, their enslaved property could reproduce more enslaved property, creating self-sustaining plantations built on the backs of generations of stolen lives. For enslaved women, the implications were horrific. Not only were they subjected to endless labor, but they were also forced to bear children who would never know freedom. Their bodies became sites of both labor and reproduction, with their offspring immediately classified as property. Slave owners saw this as a cost-effective means of expansion. Rather than purchasing new slaves, they could breed them, ensuring that their wealth and labor supply never diminished. The legal system fortified these practices. Across the colonies, laws strengthened hereditary slavery, closing every possible avenue for escape. In South Carolina and Maryland, statutes explicitly reinforced the idea that blackness itself was proof of enslavement, meaning that even those who had never been enslaved could be stripped of their freedom, simply because of their racial identity. These laws eliminated the idea of individual liberation. Slavery was no longer just a brutal labor system. It was an inherited curse, passed down through bloodlines with no possibility of breaking free. And because the colonies had created a system in which enslaved individuals reproduced future generations of enslaved labor, demand for human cargo only grew stronger. Slave owners needed more bodies, more workers to replace the sick, more enslaved women to give birth to children who could be sold, more laborers to expand their empires. The Atlantic slave trade ensured that their needs were met. The system was ruthless, methodical, and fueled by profit over humanity. European traders built vast networks to transport enslaved Africans from their homeland to the Americas, treating human life as nothing more than flesh to be bought and sold. And at the heart of this operation lay the Middle Passage, a journey so brutal, so inhumane, that death itself became preferable to survival. The Atlantic slave trade was not simply a system of forced labor. It was an industry built on the buying and selling of human lives, treating enslaved Africans as commodities rather than people. For centuries, European traders established vast networks, moving captives across continents in a relentless cycle of profit, suffering, and death. Captured men, women, and children were torn from their homes, shackled, and marched to coastal fortresses, where they were held in squalid conditions, awaiting shipment. But it was the Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic, that marked the most brutal phase of their enslavement. The slave ships were floating prisons, designed not for comfort or survival, but for maximum cargo capacity. People were crammed into the hold, bodies pressed so tightly together that movement was nearly impossible. Shackles cut into wrists and ankles, leaving raw wounds, while the stench of sweat, blood, and excrement filled the air. Disease spread rapidly, fevers claiming lives before the ship even neared land. Captives were given meager rations, barely enough to sustain them, and many wasted away from starvation or dehydration. The mortality rate was staggering. Estimates suggest that 15 to 20% of those aboard died before reaching the Americas, their bodies unceremoniously tossed into the ocean. Some resisted, attempting uprisings that were quickly crushed, or choosing suicide over suffering, leaping into the sea where death was the only escape. Survivors endured months of torment, forced onto decks for inspection, their bodies assessed like livestock, their dignity stripped away as traders haggled over their worth. By the time they arrived in the New World, they were no longer individuals. They were property, broken in spirit before they even stepped onto plantation soil. And within the suffocating confines of those ships, humanity itself had been reduced to numbers, profits, and flesh. Currency in a trade built on suffering. The conditions aboard these vessels were beyond comprehension. A world where death was routine, survival was uncertain, and existence was measured not in days, but in pain. The triangle trade was the lifeblood of transatlantic commerce in the 17th and 18th centuries, a system that moved people, goods, and suffering in a continuous cycle that fed the economies of Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It was an economic engine fueled by human bondage, transforming slavery into not just a local institution, but a global enterprise in which bodies were bought, sold, and exchanged for commodities. The first leg of this trade began in Europe, where manufactured goods, textiles, weapons, and alcohol were shipped to Africa. These goods were used as currency, exchanged with African traders and warlords in return for enslaved men, women, and children pulled from their homes, marched to the coast, and crammed into the holds of slave ships for their journey into the unknown. The second leg, known as the Middle Passage, was the brutal journey from Africa to the Americas, where human cargo was stacked like freight, chained together in suffocating conditions. Many did not survive the trip. For those who did, the final destination was the plantations of the Americas, where they were immediately auctioned, branded, and sent into fields, where their labor would feed the world economy. The third leg of the trade sent the products of slavery, sugar, tobacco, cotton, back to Europe, where they were processed, sold, and consumed, their profits reinvested into purchasing more slaves, perpetuating the system indefinitely. This cycle was relentless, unstoppable, and woven into the fabric of colonial wealth, ensuring that slavery did not simply exist. It thrived, expanding as demand for these products grew. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean demanded endless labor. Tobacco fields in Virginia required steady hands, and cotton, soon to become the backbone of the American South, needed workers who would never see freedom. The world was addicted to these commodities, and slavery became the price paid to sustain them. Every transaction, every ship, every market was a reminder that human life had been reduced to currency, bought and sold in the name of profit. Sugar, tobacco, and cotton were not just commodities. They were the backbone of the global economy, and slavery was the fuel that kept that economy running. The insatiable demand for these products meant that enslaved labor was not merely necessary, it was indispensable. From the sprawling plantations of the American South to the sugarcane fields of the Caribbean, entire industries thrived on forced human labor, their profits soaring as production expanded. European markets were addicted to sugar. Colonial economies relied on tobacco, and soon cotton, white gold, would become the most valuable crop of all. Each of these industries required endless toil, grueling work under blistering suns, back-breaking labor that stretched from sunrise to dusk with no reprieve. For enslaved individuals, survival on these plantations was not just about endurance. It was about absolute submission to a system that saw them as nothing more than tools, bodies to be used, commodities to be traded. And as demand grew, more slaves were needed. More ships arrived, more markets flourished, and more families were torn apart on the auction blocks, where human lives were sold as casually as livestock. From Charleston to New Orleans, from Richmond to Savannah, American ports turned into bustling centers for the trade in human flesh. Slave markets were arenas of cruelty, where people were examined, priced, and purchased, their futures determined by the highest bidder. Buyers ran their hands over enslaved bodies, inspecting teeth, measuring strength, checking for signs of disease, assessing them not as individuals, but as investments. Families were separated with no regard for bonds of love or lineage. A mother pulled from her child, a husband wrenched from his wife. Siblings divided, each sent in different directions, never to see one another again. The auctioneer's voice rang out over the crowd, calling prices, describing features, reducing human lives to transactions. For those on the auction block, there was no dignity, no hope, only the brutal certainty that they would never be free again. Slave markets functioned with precision, ensuring that plantations remained stocked with new workers, ensuring that the economic empire, built on bondage, never collapsed, ensuring that the cycle of suffering continued, uninterrupted. The business of slavery had been perfected, and with every auction, every sale, every shipment, America's economy grew, fed by the blood and labor of the enslaved. The auction blocks were the final step in a brutal system designed to turn human lives into commodities. In cities like Charleston, New Orleans, and Richmond, towering buildings housed bustling slave markets, where traders, plantation owners, and speculators gathered to inspect and purchase enslaved men, women, and children. The air was thick with the sounds of commerce, voices calling bids, auctioneers listing human attributes like livestock, the murmur of buyers evaluating the strength, health, and market value of those forced onto the block. Shackled together, the enslaved stood in rows, their bodies examined, their teeth inspected, their limbs prodded like cattle meant for labor. There was no acknowledgement of their humanity, only an assessment of their ability to endure endless hours in the fields, to obey commands, to produce more laborers through forced reproduction. The auctions moved quickly. The highest bidder won, no matter the consequence. Families were ripped apart without hesitation. Husbands separated from wives, mothers from children, siblings torn from one another, their hands outstretched in silent, futile protests as they were led away in different directions. Infants were sold without regard to who their parents were, and elderly slaves were dismissed as poor investments. Their bodies no longer valuable in the grueling economy of forced labor. There were no names spoken at these markets, no recognition of bonds or relationships. There were only prices, numbers scribbled onto ledgers, defining worth not by love or lineage, but by age, strength, and the promise of productivity. Those taken from the auction blocks entered an existence where their pasts ceased to matter. A new master meant a new home, a new plantation, a new life under conditions they could neither escape nor challenge. And for those who had lost everything in the transaction, their families, their children, their histories, they entered a world of silence, grief buried beneath the crushing weight of survival. Their names might have been forgotten, but their pain remained, echoing through generations long after the auction houses had closed their doors. The heartbreak of family separation was not an accident of the slave trade. It was an intentional, calculated part of the system, designed to crush resistance and sever personal ties. On the auction blocks, the enslaved were stripped of their names, their histories, their relationships reduced to a set of physical attributes, a labor potential, a price tag. A mother pleading for her child meant nothing if the buyers saw higher value in selling them separately. The sorrow of a father watching his wife dragged away meant nothing if it improved the trader's bottom line. No consideration was given to love or lineage. A strong field hand was worth more alone. A young girl fetched a better price if sold as a house servant rather than kept with her siblings. An infant passed into the hands of a new owner before they could even learn their mother's voice, became yet another piece of property, a future laborer, already owned before they could speak. The consequences of these separations were devastating. Mothers who lost their children often never saw them again. Fathers who had spent years protecting their families were forced to watch them disappear, powerless to stop the transaction. Brothers and sisters, who had clung to one another through the terrors of captivity and transport, were suddenly torn apart, each sent to separate plantations hundreds of miles away. Some enslaved people spent years searching for lost loved ones, writing desperate letters or sending word through rare networks of communication. But most never found those they had lost. Their pasts became ghosts, a life stolen from them not just by labor, but by the deliberate erasure of identity. And once the transactions were complete, once the auctioneer's hammer fell for the final time, these individuals were absorbed into the machinery of the plantation system, where whips ensured obedience, grueling labor sustained profit, and cotton fields stretched endlessly toward a future of suffering. The Southern economy did not simply rely on slavery. It was built upon it, sustained by the endless toil of enslaved people who worked from sunup to sundown with no reprieve, no freedom, no future. Cotton was king, and the plantations were its empire, demanding an army of human labor to fuel its success. Slaveholders reaped enormous wealth, profiting off a workforce that had no wages, no rights, and no way out. Each plantation functioned as a brutal economic machine, where productivity was maximized through violence, deprivation, and absolute control over human lives. The enslaved were beaten into submission, worked until their bodies failed, replaced without hesitation when they could no longer endure. The Southern economy thrived on the backs of the suffering, expanding as cotton markets soared, ensuring that slavery remained not just a tradition, but an unstoppable financial empire. The plantation economy of the American South was not just dependent on slavery, it was built upon it, structured in a way that ensured that enslaved labor was the driving force behind its expansion, wealth, and political power. The vast cotton fields stretched across the southern states, row upon row of plants that required painstaking attention, endless hours of back-breaking labor, and a workforce that could never stop, never resist, never demand fair treatment. Slavery was the engine that powered this economy, providing landowners with unpaid labor, an unceasing supply of workers, and a system that turned human suffering into wealth. The brutal reality of the plantation machine was that it relied on absolute control. Whips ensured obedience. Punishments crushed any attempt at defiance. And the relentless cycle of forced labor continued day after day. Year after year, slave owners profited enormously. Their fortunes built upon the sweat and blood of those who had no choice but to toil beneath the southern sun. The productivity of their plantations determined their influence. The more cotton they produced, the richer they became, the greater their stake in maintaining slavery as an institution. And as cotton became America's most valuable export, the demand for enslaved labor only grew stronger. Cotton was not simply a domestic product. It was the foundation of global markets, supplying the textile industries of Europe, driving international trade, and ensuring that the South remained deeply entrenched in the practice of slavery. The world wanted cotton. America produced it. And the hands that worked the fields, shackled, exhausted, stripped of freedom, were the ones who ensured its availability. The dependence on forced labor was not a hidden truth. it was openly acknowledged, defended by politicians, protected by law, and justified by plantation owners who saw slavery as not just necessary, but essential to the survival of their way of life. As cotton demand soared, so too did the push for expansion, the desire for more land, more enslaved workers, more plantations that could feed the insatiable hunger for profit. Slavery was no longer just a practice. It was an institution deeply woven into America's economic, social, and political identity, shaping the country in ways that would last far beyond the Civil War and the eventual fall of the plantation system. Cotton's global demand ensured that slavery remained unchallenged for decades, solidifying America's reliance on forced labor and marking one of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. Cotton was the fuel that drove the American economy, an industry so powerful that it dictated both national policy and international trade. The insatiable global demand for cotton meant that every plantation was an economic engine, churning out crops bound for textile mills in England, France, and beyond. The southern states relied entirely on the profitability of cotton, and in turn, they relied entirely on forced labor to produce it. Without enslaved workers tending the fields, America's cotton empire would not exist. The cotton trade was so lucrative that plantation owners ignored every moral argument against slavery, justifying the practice through economic necessity, racial theories, and religious doctrine. Enslaved workers endured horrific conditions, laboring from dawn until dusk in fields that stretched endlessly before them, their bodies pushed past exhaustion, their labor uncompensated except by meager rations meant to keep them alive long enough to harvest another season. Cotton was not just America's most valuable crop, it was a global commodity, with British textile factories depending on southern plantations to keep their mills running, ensuring that slavery was not just an American institution, but an international system of oppression. This reliance meant that the South clung to slavery, even as abolitionist movements grew louder, refusing to relinquish a system that had turned landowners into millionaires and Southern aristocrats into an untouchable ruling class. The economics were inescapable. Without slavery, cotton production would plummet, wealth would disappear, and the Southern way of life would collapse. And so, enslaved workers continued to sweat, bleed, and suffer in the fields, their bodies bent beneath the weight of an industry that saw them as nothing more than tools for profit. Life on a plantation was dictated by routine, a brutal cycle of labor, punishment, and control that never wavered. From the first light of dawn until the last flickers of dusk, life on a plantation was dictated by relentless cycles of labor, control, and punishment. There was no reprieve, no moment of rest, only the never-ending demands of the field. The sharp crack of overseers' whips and the suffocating weight of a system designed to break the human spirit. Enslaved people were awakened before sunrise, often by the distant ringing of a bell or the shouted commands of plantation drivers. Sleep was fleeting, exhaustion permanent, but their bodies had no choice but to rise and move toward the fields. The plantation machine depended on efficiency, and every second of the day had been calculated to extract the maximum amount of labor from those who had no choice but to obey. The cotton fields, tobacco patches, and sugarcane rows stretched endlessly before them, the land itself a testament to their suffering. Bent backs, blistered hands, aching muscles. None of it mattered to the overseers, whose sole task was to ensure speed, precision, and submission. The sun was merciless, baking the earth and the laborers alike, sweat dripping down weary bodies as hands worked tirelessly to pick, gather, bundle. Those who moved too slow were punished with lashes, each strike a reminder that pain was their only alternative to obedience. Those who spoke out faced even worse fates: beatings, shackles, confinement. Resistance was met not with compromise, but with violence, ensuring that thoughts of escape, rebellion, or even defiance were crushed before they could take shape. Beyond the fields, the plantation's strict control extended into every aspect of life. Religion was wielded as a weapon. Sermons crafted to reinforce the idea that submission was divine law, that obedience to their masters was God's will, that suffering was part of the grand design. Preachers, often hand-selected by slave owners, quoted scripture that justified servitude, twisting faith into a doctrine of silence and acceptance. Even prayer, something meant to offer comfort, was corrupted by those in power, shaped into another tool of control. And yet, despite the crushing weight of oppression, enslaved people found ways to endure. Their spirits, though battered, were never fully extinguished. Songs hummed softly under their breath. Whispered conversations of resistance passed between trusted souls. Small acts of defiance hidden in their daily routines. Tiny sparks that proved they were more than property, more than numbers on a ledger, more than hands made for labor. But surviving was not the same as living. Their existence was dictated not just by their work, but by the conditions that surrounded them: their clothing, their food, their treatment at the hands of their masters. The unspoken horrors that many endured in silence. The plantation was not just a place of labor. It was a prison, and for many, it was a nightmare that never ended. The enslaved existed under conditions designed to strip them of autonomy, dignity, and hope. Their food was often barely edible, a meager ration of cornmeal, salted pork, or molasses that kept them alive, but never truly sustained them. Malnutrition was common, hunger a constant ache, and plantation owners viewed food only as a necessity to maintain productivity, never a matter of care or well-being. Clothing was just as brutal: coarse, poorly fitted, easily torn, fabric so thin it barely shielded against cold winters or scorching summers. Children often went without shoes, their feet hardened by years of walking on rough terrain, while adults were given a single set of garments per year, their bodies left to endure the elements with no relief. Treatment depended on the whims of their owners, but cruelty was ever present. The enslaved were beaten for working too slow, whipped for showing resistance, punished for crimes real or imagined, their bodies scarred as a permanent reminder of their status. Some endured torture beyond the lash: iron collars, branding, mutilation. Forms of punishment meant not just to cause pain, but to ensure absolute submission. Fear governed their lives, lingering in every moment of silence, in every glance toward an overseer, in every step near the master's house, where the worst horrors often took place. Sexual abuse was rampant. Enslaved women were subjected to violence, coercion, and exploitation, used as objects of power rather than individuals with agency. Some were forced into breeding, ensuring that future generations of enslaved children would continue the cycle of servitude. Others became victims of repeated assaults, trapped in a system that offered no justice, no escape, no way to fight back. Their trauma was ignored, buried beneath the machinery of slavery, their suffering unspoken, because there was no one to listen, no one to stop it. Every aspect of their existence was dictated by fear. Fear of separation, fear of punishment, fear of death, fear of the unknown. And through that fear, slavery thrived. Not just in the South, but in the North as well, where the illusion of morality masked an undeniable truth. Northern states also benefited from slavery. Their industries, fueled by the labor of enslaved, people, their economies intertwined with a system they claimed to oppose. The myth that slavery was solely a Southern institution is one of the most enduring distortions in American history. While the South relied on enslaved labor to fuel its economy, the North was far from innocent. It benefited enormously from the forced labor of millions, building its own industries, financial empires, and institutions on the backs of enslaved workers, without the direct visibility of Southern plantations. Northern ports were bustling centers of trade, processing shipments of cotton, tobacco, and sugar harvested by enslaved hands. Textile mills in places like Massachusetts thrived on Southern-grown cotton, turning raw material into fabric that was then sold worldwide, feeding an economy that was deeply intertwined with slavery even if enslaved people were not forced to labor inside the factories themselves. The banking sector was no different. Northern banks financed the slave trade, issuing loans for plantations, insuring slave ships, and investing directly in the economic machinery of bondage. Even Wall Street, now synonymous with global finance, had roots in slavery. In the early years of American expansion, human beings were used as collateral for loans, their lives leveraged as financial assets to secure business ventures across the colonies. Investors profited from the industry of slavery, ensuring that the system was not just tolerated, but actively sustained. Universities, too, were complicit. Many of America's oldest institutions, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, were funded by money generated from the slave trade. Whether through wealthy donors, plantation investments, or direct participation in industries dependent on forced labor. The entire nation, not just the South, was entangled in the profits of slavery. The difference was only in its visibility. Southern plantations made the brutality plain for all to see, while Northern industries wrapped slavery in layers of commerce, transactions, and financial exchanges, hiding the reality behind ledgers and contracts. But make no mistake, America was built on slavery, and every major economic sector had its hands in its profits. Slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was an American one, deeply woven into the nation's financial, educational, and industrial framework. While the plantations of the South provided the raw materials, cotton, sugar, tobacco, the industries of the North processed, financed, and profited from the system, ensuring that even those who claimed moral opposition were still direct beneficiaries of forced labor. Wall Street, now synonymous with global finance, had roots firmly planted in the slave trade. In the early years of the American economy, enslaved people were used as collateral for loans, their lives leveraged as financial assets in business ventures across the colonies. Major banks provided credit to plantation owners, financing the purchase of enslaved workers and ensuring that slavery remained profitable and expandable. They did not merely tolerate the existence of slavery, they sustained it, directly investing in an institution that generated enormous profits. Some of America's most prestigious universities were similarly entangled in the economics of enslavement. Institutions like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton benefited from donors whose wealth came from slavery, and many universities even owned enslaved people, forcing them into labor, while professors taught theories of freedom and democracy to students who would later inherit the very system, built on stolen lives. Northern factories thrived on cotton picked by enslaved hands, transforming raw materials into textiles sold around the world, proving that slavery was not just a Southern practice. It was a national economy, upheld by industries that relied on it, protected by lawmakers who refused to dismantle it, and defended by businessmen who understood that abolition threatened their profits. And yet, despite the overwhelming forces working to maintain slavery, resistance never ceased. Enslaved people refused to surrender their humanity, finding ways to fight back within the confines of their oppression, carving out small but powerful acts of defiance that challenged their captivity. Sabotage became a quiet form of rebellion, tools broken, work undone, mistakes made deliberately to slow production and frustrate overseers. Field hands whispered strategies among themselves, carefully coordinating work slowdowns, their movements deliberate, forcing plantation owners to suffer financial losses without direct confrontation. Secret literacy was another form of resistance. Despite laws forbidding enslaved people from learning to read and write, many taught themselves in secret, passing knowledge through quiet lessons in the shadows, understanding that education was a weapon capable of dismantling the chains placed upon them. Music, too, became an act of rebellion. Songs carried coded messages, warnings of approaching danger, escape routes embedded in melodies that seemed simple, but held meaning far beyond what overseers understood. In every stolen moment, in every whispered lesson, in every deliberate act of defiance, enslaved people proved that their spirits, though battered, were never truly broken. Slavery was built upon control, but resistance ensured that control was never absolute. Despite the brutal conditions of slavery, enslaved people never stopped resisting. Their defiance was woven into daily life, sometimes subtle, sometimes bold, but always present. Open revolt was rare. Armed rebellion risked overwhelming retaliation, but resistance existed in countless forms. Sabotage was one method. Tools mysteriously broke, crops were improperly harvested, machinery failed, livestock escaped, all seemingly accidental but often intentional, meant to slow plantation productivity and frustrate overseers. Work slowdowns were another tactic, as enslaved individuals moved deliberately at a sluggish pace, forcing plantation owners to endure financial losses without directly confronting authority. These acts of defiance were dangerous, as punishment for disobedience was swift and brutal. Yet they persisted because they offered a small but powerful measure of control. Literacy, though banned for most enslaved people, became a secret weapon. Learning to read and write was illegal in many states, as slaveholders knew education could spark rebellion. Yet enslaved individuals found ways to teach each other in secret, passing knowledge through whispered lessons, stolen scraps of paper, and hidden books. Some used their literacy to forge passports, travel papers, or even escape routes, proving that knowledge was one of the greatest threats to the institution of slavery. Music, too, held rebellion in its notes. Coded songs carried messages of escape, resistance, and warning. Spirituals often doubled as signals, guiding runaways, alerting communities to danger, or offering solace in moments of despair. Enslaved individuals sang in the fields, the melodies appearing innocent, yet beneath the surface, they held meanings only they could understand. But some forms of resistance took bolder turns. Some enslaved people refused to accept their fate quietly, choosing to rise up in open rebellion, risking everything for freedom. Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner led three of the most famous uprisings in American history, each one a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to submit. Their rebellions shook the foundations of slavery, proving that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the desire for freedom could never be extinguished. Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner stood as symbols of defiance against an institution designed to strip them of everything: their freedom, their families, their futures. Their rebellions were acts of extraordinary courage, an undeniable testament to the fact that enslaved people never accepted their bondage silently. In 1800, Gabriel Prosser, a literate blacksmith from Virginia, meticulously planned a large-scale uprising that aimed to take Richmond and establish an independent black state. Inspired by the Haitian Revolution, he gathered hundreds of enslaved and free black men, all ready to rise against their oppressors. But on the night of the attack, a storm flooded the roads, delaying their march. Betrayed by fellow slaves fearful of punishment, the rebellion was crushed before it could begin. Prosser and dozens of his followers were executed, and Virginia responded by tightening slave laws, ensuring such uprisings would be even harder to organize. Denmark Vesey's rebellion followed in 1822. A formerly enslaved man who had purchased his freedom, Vesey became a fierce advocate for liberation, plotting a mass insurrection in Charleston, South Carolina. His plan was ambitious. Thousands of enslaved people were to seize weapons, kill slaveholders, and escape to Haiti, where freedom was possible. But once again, betrayal unraveled the plot before it could be set into motion. Vesey and his co-conspirators were arrested and executed, their deaths serving as a brutal warning to others who dared to dream of revolt. Then, in 1831, Nat Turner ignited one of the most infamous uprisings in American history. A deeply religious preacher, Turner believed himself chosen by God to lead his people out of bondage. Gathering a small but determined group, he launched a rebellion across Southampton County, Virginia, killing dozens of white slaveholders and their families, sparking terror throughout the South. For a brief moment, enslaved people tasted victory. They moved through the countryside, gaining followers, striking down those who had brutalized them for generations. But when state militia forces arrived, Turner's rebellion was crushed. He hid for weeks but was eventually captured, tried, and executed. The response to his uprising was swift, violent, and merciless. The brutal backlash to these rebellions did not stop at executions. Southern states passed terrifying new laws, tightening control over enslaved populations, ensuring that another rebellion would be nearly impossible. Literacy bans grew stricter, travel restrictions tightened, and slave patrols intensified, ensuring that white supremacy remained unchallenged. The South understood that uprisings were not just rare acts of defiance. They were proof that slavery was unstable, that it relied on fear, and that enslaved people would always seek freedom no matter the cost. So they doubled down, unleashing waves of terror, ensuring that rebellion carried the highest price possible. The brutal repression of slave rebellions was swift and merciless. Whenever enslaved people dared to rise up against their oppressors, the response was designed not just to crush the rebellion itself, but to send a message that would reverberate across every plantation, every slave market, every corner of the South. Resistance would not be tolerated. It would be met with terror, with suffering, with an unrelenting wave of violence, meant to stamp out even the thought of freedom. After Gabriel Prosser's planned uprising was thwarted, Virginia officials executed dozens of black men. Some guilty of conspiracy, others merely suspected of involvement. The punishment was not just about eliminating those who had plotted the rebellion, but about terrifying the rest of the enslaved population into submission. Denmark Vesey's revolt in 1822 sparked an even harsher backlash. More than 130 black men were arrested, many of whom were tortured and coerced into giving information about the rebellion. Vesey and his conspirators were sentenced to death, and South Carolina responded by passing strict laws banning literacy, tightening restrictions on gatherings, and increasing patrols to prevent any future insurrections. But it was Nat Turner's rebellion that terrified white slaveholders more than any before it. Turner and his followers had moved through Virginia, killing dozens of white families, proving that enslaved people were willing to fight, to kill, to risk everything for freedom. The Southern response was a wave of terror, unlike anything seen before. Turner himself was captured and executed, but the retaliation extended far beyond the rebels. Hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children were killed, many of them completely uninvolved in the uprising, their deaths serving as a warning to others who might have dared to follow in Turner's footsteps. Virginia passed laws banning black people from preaching, increasing patrols, and ensuring stricter controls over every enslaved person in the state. The lesson was clear. Rebellion would bring death, not just to the rebels, but to entire communities. The South doubled down on slavery's grip. New terror laws ensured absolute control over enslaved populations. Literacy was further restricted. Slaveholders knew that education led to rebellion. So they made certain that reading and writing were reserved only for white citizens. Enslaved gatherings were outlawed unless supervised, ensuring that no group could meet to plan insurrection. The consequences of disobedience grew even harsher. Whippings, beatings, mutilations, and even execution for those caught defying white authority. Slave patrols expanded, roaming the countryside to hunt down runaways and intimidate enslaved communities into submission. And yet, despite this brutal crackdown, the dream of freedom never died. Many enslaved people understood that rebellion, though noble, was nearly impossible in the face of overwhelming military power and surveillance. But escape, that was the quiet revolution, the act of defiance that could still lead to liberation. And within the shadows of America's deepest injustices, the Underground Railroad emerged, a secret network of resistance, led by those who risked their lives to pull others out of bondage. Harriet Tubman became the most legendary conductor of this network, guiding countless enslaved people to freedom through a system of hidden routes, safe houses, and coded messages. Enslaved communities developed intricate strategies to communicate escape plans, using songs, quilts, whispers, and subtle signals to guide those who sought the impossible, a life beyond slavery. Harriet Tubman's name became synonymous with freedom. But the Underground Railroad was not a single effort. It was an intricate, life-threatening network woven together by hundreds of abolitionists, formerly enslaved people, and secret allies who dared to defy the laws of slavery. It was not a literal railroad, but a hidden system of escape routes, safe houses, and coded communication designed to shepherd the enslaved out of captivity, moving them northward toward free states, or even farther, to Canada, where the Fugitive Slave Act could no longer reach them. At the heart of this network was Tubman, a woman born into bondage, but unwilling to accept a life without freedom. She escaped on her own, navigating forests and backroads, risking death at every turn, and once she tasted liberty, she refused to leave others behind. She returned again and again, guiding entire families, risking her own life to lead others through the darkness toward the promise of safety. Her bravery was unmatched. She never lost a single passenger. Her determination so unwavering that enslavers placed massive rewards for her capture, though none succeeded in stopping her. The Underground Railroad relied on secrecy, deception, and coded messages. Enslaved communities used songs to signal movement, disguising escape plans in the lyrics of spirituals, hidden directions telling runaways which way to travel, warnings about dangers ahead, calls to prepare for departure. Quilts, draped across fences or windows, contained patterns with coded instructions. guiding those seeking freedom towards safe havens or cautioning them about patrols. Conductors, abolitionists who helped transport fugitives, created false identities, forged documents, smuggled people in wagons with hidden compartments, and sent disguised runaways through dangerous territory, all in defiance of the brutal system that sought to keep them shackled forever. Every journey was a gamble with death. Slave catchers patrolled borders, hunting those who dared to flee. Laws made escape nearly impossible, and those who were caught faced beatings, imprisonment, or even execution. Yet the dream of freedom burned stronger than fear. The enslaved were willing to risk everything: their lives, their families, their futures, for just a glimpse of liberation, for a life where their bodies were no longer owned, where their labor was no longer stolen, where their children could grow without chains wrapped around their destiny. The Underground Railroad was more than a path to freedom. It was proof that slavery could never truly kill hope. Freedom was never guaranteed, and for those who sought to escape slavery, the journey north was one of unimaginable peril. Every step carried the risk of capture. Every whispered plan could mean betrayal. Every safe house could be raided at any moment. Yet enslaved people still fled, still risked everything for a chance to breathe a free air, for a life where they would not be bought, sold, or worked to the brink of death. Some traveled alone, disappearing into forests, following rivers, avoiding roads where patrols hunted the missing. Others found shelter within the Underground Railroad, guided by abolitionists who offered passage in wagons, hiding places beneath floorboards, false papers, and coded messages leading them ever farther from the plantations that had stolen their lives. Harriet Tubman became the most legendary conductor, leading dozens to freedom, risking capture with every journey south, returning again and again despite the price on her head. Her determination was relentless. She never lost a single person under her guidance. But escape was only half the battle. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made even the free states dangerous, allowing slave catchers to invade northern territories, seize fugitives, and drag them back into bondage. Many who had fled found their safety tenuous, forcing them to seek refuge in Canada, beyond the reach of southern laws. Even those who had never been enslaved lived under the shadow of injustice. Free black communities in northern cities were still vulnerable to wrongful capture, kidnapped and sold into slavery with no way to prove their freedom. The pursuit of liberty was never without obstacles. Yet the drive to escape, the refusal to submit, the sheer willpower of those who resisted slavery showed a truth that could never be erased. Enslaved people were never passive victims. They were fighters, strategists, survivors who defied the system with every breath they took. As the years passed and more enslaved people reached freedom, the tensions between North and South grew unbearable. The fight over slavery had not been confined to plantations. It had bled into politics, into courtrooms, debates, legislation, until the cracks in America's foundation became too deep to ignore. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had attempted to keep the peace, dividing free and slave states along a rigid line, but it was only a temporary solution, delaying the inevitable. By the 1850s, the question of slavery exploded into violence, particularly in Kansas, where abolitionists and pro-slavery settlers clashed in open conflict, turning the territory into a battleground of brutality. The United States was not just divided, it was on the brink of war, and slavery was the fault line that threatened to break the nation apart forever. As the 19th century progressed, America's delicate balance on the issue of slavery began to collapse. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had been an attempt to keep the peace, drawing a line across the nation. Territories north of it would be free, while those south could maintain slavery. But such a compromise was never sustainable. The rapid expansion westward meant new territories needed to be settled, and the question of whether slavery would spread ignited furious debate. The illusion of unity unraveled further with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise, allowing settlers in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether slavery would be legal. What followed was Bleeding Kansas, a period of violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, a preview of the bloodshed that would consume the nation. Militias formed, towns burned, and armed men fought in brutal skirmishes over the soul of the territory. The North saw these events as proof that slavery was corrupting America beyond repair, while the South viewed resistance as an existential threat to its economic and social order. The divide hardened into hostility, and the stage was set for war. Yet amid this turmoil, abolitionist voices grew louder. No longer a quiet movement confined to radical thinkers, abolitionism took center stage, spearheaded by figures who refused to accept a nation half slave and half free. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave who became one of the most powerful orators of his time, used his voice to expose slavery's horrors, writing memoirs, delivering speeches, and confronting politicians who defended human bondage. Sojourner Truth, a woman born into slavery who fought for both abolition and women's rights, electrified audiences with her unwavering demand for justice. William Lloyd Garrison, the publisher of The Liberator, made abolitionism his life's mission, advocating for immediate emancipation and refusing to compromise on the horrors of slavery. Their words spread like wildfire, shifting public opinion, forcing America to reckon with the truth it had long tried to avoid. The movement gained strength, and the South felt the pressure mounting. The battle for slavery's survival was no longer just in politics or on the battlefield. It was in the hearts and minds of every American, and those fighting for freedom would not be silenced. Abolitionism was no longer just a quiet movement whispered in small gatherings. It had become a force, a relentless wave of resistance against an institution that had defined America for centuries. The voices that led the charge were unwavering. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery but determined to fight for its destruction, used his intellect, eloquence, and experience to shatter every argument in favor of bondage. His autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, exposed the horrors of slavery to the world, proving that an enslaved person was not simply a laborer, but a human being with thoughts, ambitions, and emotions. His speeches left audiences in awe. His command of language, his righteous fury, his ability to dissect the lies of white supremacy made him one of the most feared and respected voices in abolitionism. Sojourner Truth, a woman born into slavery who became a warrior for both abolition and women's rights, carried her truth into every room she entered. She stood before crowds, challenging them to recognize her humanity, her power, her refusal to be silenced. "Ain't I a woman?" she asked, tearing apart the notion that black women should be ignored, that the fight for justice could exclude those whose voices had been stolen for generations. And then there was William Lloyd Garrison, a man unwilling to compromise, who saw slavery as an unforgivable crime against humanity. His newspaper, The Liberator, refused to soften its message. Slavery must end immediately, with no conditions, no gradualism, no excuses. Garrison called out politicians, church leaders, businessmen. Anyone who stood by and let slavery exist was complicit. and he made sure they knew it. Their words spread across the nation, defying the powerful slave-holding elite. Abolitionist newspapers poured into southern states, smuggled in secret, read in hushed voices by those who longed for freedom. Pamphlets, speeches, books. The pen became a weapon, cutting deeper than any whip, exposing the cruelty of the plantation system to the entire world. The South raged against these voices, banning abolitionist materials, passing laws against discussion of freedom, tightening its grip on enslaved communities as the message of resistance grew louder. But it was too late. The words had already sunk deep into the fabric of the country, and slavery's days were numbered. The war between the plantation and the pen had begun, and the battle for America's soul could no longer be ignored. The battle between abolitionist voices and the entrenched power of the plantation system grew fiercer with every passing year. Writers, speakers, and activists turned words into weapons, exposing the brutal reality of slavery in ways that could no longer be ignored. The South fought back, not with reason or argument, but with laws meant to strengthen bondage, ensuring that even as the abolitionist movement gained momentum, enslaved people remained trapped under a system designed to keep them powerless forever. Every speech, every book, every pamphlet that called for freedom was met with new restrictions, new barriers meant to silence those who dared to defy the slaveholding elite. The plantation owners understood that the greatest threat to slavery was knowledge, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that the enslaved remained ignorant, cut off from the growing cries for emancipation. Despite their efforts, abolitionist literature spread far and wide. Frederick Douglass's powerful words reached beyond the halls of academia, landing in the hands of everyday people, forcing them to confront the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed liberty while maintaining bondage. Harriet Beecher Stowe's uncle, Tom's Cabin, sent shockwaves through the American consciousness, bringing slavery's cruelty into homes that had long ignored it. William Lloyd Garrison refused to soften his rhetoric, demanding immediate abolition, rejecting any compromise with slaveholders. Their words infected the minds of the North, creating a moral divide that threatened the fragile political balance between free states and slave states. As the abolitionist movement gained strength, Southern lawmakers reacted with increasing desperation, crafting legal frameworks to reinforce slavery, to make it even harder to escape, to ensure that freedom was never truly attainable. This led to one of the most oppressive laws in American history, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This legislation was a direct response to the success of the Underground Railroad and the growing number of enslaved people who had managed to reach the North. The law required that all escaped slaves be returned to their owners, even if they had reached free states, stripping fugitives of any legal protection, any right to sanctuary. It did not just target the enslaved, it targeted those who helped them, punishing abolitionists, ordinary citizens, and even law enforcement officials who refused to comply. Free black individuals were at risk as well. Many were wrongfully captured, accused of being escaped slaves, dragged back into bondage despite never having set foot on a plantation. The South had found a way to extend the chains of slavery beyond its own borders, forcing the North into complicity, making it clear that no place in America was truly safe for black people seeking freedom. Then, in 1857, the infamous Dred Scott decision cemented the legal reinforcement of slavery in devastating fashion. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, petitioned for his freedom, arguing that residence in a free state had made him legally free. The case reached the Supreme Court, And in one of the most infamous rulings in American history, Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that black people, whether enslaved or free, had no legal rights under the U.S. Constitution. The ruling denied citizenship to all black Americans, claiming that they had no standing in court and could never be truly free in the eyes of the law. It was a decision that confirmed the worst fears of abolitionists. Slavery was not just protected by Southern politicians, but by the highest court in the nation, ensuring that every legal path to freedom was effectively shut down. The ruling enraged abolitionists, proving beyond doubt that slavery would not end through peaceful legislation or gradual reform. It had to be destroyed outright, and the only way to do that was through conflict, resistance, and war. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Dred Scott decision of 1857 were two of the most devastating legal reinforcements of slavery in American history, ensuring that freedom was never truly secure, even for those who had escaped bondage. The Fugitive Slave Act was a direct response to the growing abolitionist movement and the success of the Underground Railroad, which had already helped thousands of enslaved people reach free states. Southern lawmakers, enraged by the number of runaways, demanded a more aggressive legal tool to retrieve enslaved individuals from the North, forcing the federal government to comply. Under this new law, any escaped slave could be captured and returned to their owner, no matter how many years they had lived in freedom, and Northern citizens were legally required to assist in their capture. Refusing to cooperate was a crime. Abolitionists, free black communities, and sympathetic white allies suddenly found themselves under the watchful eye of the law, unable to safely harbor fugitives without facing imprisonment or crippling fines. The law weaponized the federal government against the enslaved, placing authority in the hands of slave catchers who roamed northern cities, kidnapping black individuals, often without evidence, relying on corrupt judges known as commissioners, who had a financial incentive to declare them fugitives. If accused, a suspected fugitive had no right to testify in their own defense. A single white witness could sentence them to bondage, even if they had never set foot on a plantation before. The South had effectively extended the reach of slavery beyond its own borders, proving that even freedom was fragile, temporary, and conditional. Enslaved individuals who had spent years building new lives in the North now found themselves hunted, their safety stripped away by a system that refused to recognize their humanity. Some abolitionist communities defied the law, forming vigilante groups, safe houses, resistance networks, but the federal government cracked down, ensuring that slaveholders retained control no matter how far an enslaved person fled. Even worse, free black citizens were at risk too. Many were wrongfully captured, accused of being runaways despite legal documentation proving otherwise. Entire families lived in terror, knowing that any day they could be dragged away from their homes, their futures stolen by the hands of slave traders and judges eager to appease Southern power. The law shattered any illusion that the North was a safe haven, proving that as long as slavery existed anywhere in America, no black person was truly free. Then came the Dred Scott decision, which cemented the judicial betrayal of black Americans. Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, petitioned for his freedom, arguing that his residence in free states should make him legally free. His case reached the Supreme Court, and in a ruling that shattered any hope for legal emancipation, Chief Justice Roger Taney declared that black Americans, enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. Taney's decision was not just cruel, It was deliberate, calculated, designed to strip black people of any legal standing, ensuring that slavery remained protected, untouchable, and unquestioned by federal law. The ruling denied freedom to all black Americans, stating that they were property, not people, and had no claim to justice in the courts of the United States. This meant that even free black individuals in the North were not legally recognized as citizens, no matter how long they had lived outside the South, no matter how many generations had been born into freedom. It was a decision meant to reinforce white supremacy, to ensure that abolitionist movements would never succeed in dismantling slavery through legal channels, to confirm that black people had no future in America beyond servitude. The ruling sent shockwaves across the country, enraging abolitionists, emboldening slaveholders, and further cementing the divide between North and South. The country was breaking apart, and the legal system had chosen its side. It stood with slavery, with the plantation class, with the oppressors, and for enslaved people, for fugitives, for free black communities who had spent years fighting for recognition and safety. The message was clear. Even the North wasn't a guarantee of safety. Even in the so-called free North, black Americans, whether escaped slaves or those born into freedom, were never truly safe. The Fugitive Slave Act had shattered the illusion that the North was a refuge, turning free states into hunting grounds for slave catchers who operated with near total impunity, dragging fugitives back into bondage, even if they had lived in freedom for decades. Free black communities lived under constant threat, knowing that their citizenship was fragile, their rights not truly recognized, and their safety always conditional. Racism in the North was hardly better than in the South. Many white Northerners, though opposed to slavery's expansion, still viewed black people as inferior, still resisted their inclusion into society, still feared their growing numbers. Segregation, discrimination, and exclusion were rampant, and while abolitionists fought tirelessly for justice, the system itself was designed to ensure that, even outside of slavery, black Americans remained oppressed, vulnerable, and unwanted. Northern states passed laws restricting black mobility, limiting land ownership, and denying equal rights, ensuring that even those who had escaped the whip remained under the shadow of white supremacy. Escaped slaves faced relentless pursuit. Free black citizens faced unjust arrests and deportation, and abolitionists who sheltered fugitives risked prison sentences and financial ruin. Freedom was not truly free. It was precarious, dangerous, and often temporary, as tensions between North and South reached their boiling point. Slavery's grip on America could no longer be ignored, and the country hurtled toward the bloodiest war in its history. The Civil War was not, as many revisionists would later claim, merely about states' rights. It was about slavery, first and foremost. The Southern states seceded to protect their right to own human beings, and every political debate that led to war centered on slavery's survival or destruction. The South's economy was built on forced labor, and its leaders knew that abolition threatened their wealth, power, and way of life. The secession documents of Confederate states explicitly cited slavery as the primary reason for breaking from the Union. Southern politicians openly declared their refusal to live in a country where black people could be free, arguing that their entire society depended on keeping them in chains. The myth of states' rights was nothing more than a smokescreen, an excuse that failed to hide the truth. The Confederacy fought for slavery, and the Union fought to end it. The war was inevitable, not because of differing interpretations of government power, but because America had allowed slavery to poison its foundations for too long. The country could no longer exist half slave and half free. Blood would be shed on both sides, and the future of the nation would be decided on the battlefield. The Civil War was not fought over some abstract principle of states' rights. It was fought over slavery, first and foremost. The Southern states seceded from the Union explicitly to protect their right to enslave human beings, and every major political debate leading up to the war had centered around the survival or destruction of slavery as an institution. Even in the decades before the first shots were fired, tensions between North and South had boiled over not because of tariff disputes or constitutional interpretation, but because the South understood that slavery was under threat, and they were willing to fight to protect it. The Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Dred Scott decision. All of these were battles over slavery, fought in courtrooms, legislatures, and violent clashes in newly settled territories. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, Southern leaders did not claim he threatened states' rights in general. They were explicit in their reasoning. They feared he would end slavery, and that was unacceptable. South Carolina was the first to secede, and in its Declaration of Secession, it clearly stated that the North's growing abolitionist sentiment and refusal to return fugitive slaves posed a direct threat to their way of life. Other states followed, each with similar statements that placed slavery at the core of their decision to break from the Union. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, made it unmistakably clear in his infamous Cornerstone speech, declaring that the Confederacy was built upon the great truth, that the black race was inferior and meant to be enslaved. The Southern economy was built entirely on forced labor, and slaveholders knew that abolition would devastate their wealth, their plantations, and their social order. The Confederate government, formed in direct opposition to Lincoln and the Republican-led Union, was structured explicitly to preserve slavery, ensuring that no future government could interfere with the practice. The Confederate Constitution was nearly identical to the U.S. Constitution, except that it explicitly protected slavery, enshrining it as a permanent and untouchable institution. The Confederacy did not secede because of vague concerns over government power. It seceded because slavery was in danger, and they were willing to kill to keep it. Even the post-war myth that Confederate soldiers were fighting for heritage ignores the blatant reality. They fought for a nation that existed solely to ensure human bondage would continue indefinitely. The Southern elite saw abolition as an existential threat, and they chose war over compromise, blood over morality, destruction over justice. The Civil War was a war over slavery, fought in fields soaked with death, in cities torn apart by cannon fire, in families ripped apart by ideology. And as the Union prepared to march against the Confederacy, the message was clear: this would be the fight that determined whether America was a land of freedom or a nation built on chains. The Confederacy's very foundation rested upon slavery. It was not a peripheral issue, nor simply one of economic convenience, but the central pillar upon which the Southern states built their government, their economy, and their identity. The idea that the Civil War was fought over states' rights ignores the undeniable truth. The only right the Confederacy sought to protect was the right to own human beings. From the moment Southern states seceded, they made it clear in their declarations and public statements that their primary grievance was the perceived threat to slavery. Southern politicians and plantation owners feared that Abraham Lincoln's presidency signaled the beginning of the end of their way of life. Not because he promised immediate abolition, but because they believed any restriction on slavery was the first step toward its destruction. They did not merely seek independence. They sought a nation where black people could never be free, a country built explicitly to preserve human bondage in perpetuity. The Confederate Constitution confirmed this intent. While largely modeled after the U.S. Constitution, it contained explicit protections for slavery, ensuring that no law could ever be passed to abolish or even restrict it. It did not merely allow the practice of slavery, it enshrined it as a permanent and unchangeable institution, guaranteeing the legal status of enslaved people's property, not as individuals with rights or agency. This was the heart of the Confederacy, a government formed not in defense of liberty, but in defense of human ownership, forced labor, and racial hierarchy. Southern leaders justified this system with rhetoric steeped in racism, claiming that black people were naturally suited for servitude, that slavery was not a moral failing, but a divine order, that their wealth, their plantations, their entire society could not exist without the exploitation of enslaved labor. And so, when war broke out, the Confederacy fought not for independence in the abstract, but for the preservation of an economy dependent on human suffering. Southern generals, soldiers, and plantation owners understood that if they lost, slavery would not survive, and this was their greatest fear. While Confederate troops marched under banners of rebellion and self-governance, their cause was unmistakable. They fought to keep people in chains, to maintain a system where wealth was built upon backs, beaten into submission. And as the war raged across battlefields, enslaved people began seizing the moment, finding ways to escape, risking their lives to flee toward Union lines, where the promise of freedom, though uncertain, was far better than the certainty of bondage. As the Civil War raged, enslaved people seized the opportunity to break free from the chains that had bound them for generations. While the Union Army marched deeper into Confederate territory, enslaved individuals took immense risks, slipping away from plantations under the cover of night, trekking through forests and swamps, evading slave patrols, and heading toward Union lines with nothing but the hope of freedom to guide them. Some fled alone, carrying only the clothes on their backs. Others escaped in groups, relying on whispered directions, hidden routes, and a network of informants who helped them navigate toward safety. Every step was fraught with danger. If caught, they faced brutal punishment, often whipped or even executed as a warning to others. Yet still, they ran. Still, they resisted. Still, they fought against a system determined to hold them captive. As Union troops advanced, many enslaved people arrived at their camps, unsure of what awaited them, uncertain whether freedom was truly within reach. Some officers welcomed them, providing protection and shelter, but others were reluctant, fearing political consequences or logistical challenges. Yet the sheer number of escaped slaves flooding Union camps made it impossible to ignore them. These fugitives, often called contraband by the military, forced the Union to confront the reality that slavery was collapsing, not just through battle, but through the will of enslaved people who refused to wait for their liberation. This unprecedented movement of enslaved people escaping toward the Union lines added a moral urgency to the war, one that Abraham Lincoln could not ignore. While the war had initially been framed as a battle to preserve the Union, rather than an outright war against slavery, the presence of thousands of formerly enslaved men, women, and children demanded a change in strategy. Union generals began employing them as laborers, cooks, nurses, and eventually as soldiers, transforming them from fugitives into participants in their own liberation. The flood of escapees made it clear that slavery could not survive the war, and Lincoln, recognizing both the moral and strategic necessity of emancipation, prepared one of the most defining documents of American history. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a decree that declared enslaved people in Confederate, controlled territories free. While it did not immediately end slavery everywhere, it was a turning point, a declaration that the war was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery once and for all. The proclamation transformed the conflict, giving the Union a moral cause, encouraging enslaved people to continue fleeing toward the North, and paving the way for the eventual abolition of slavery in America. It was both symbolic and strategic, ensuring that freedom, once promised, could never be undone. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863, was both a moral declaration and a military strategy, shifting the war's purpose from preserving the Union to ending slavery itself. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, as it applied only to those in Confederate controlled territories, it marked the beginning of slavery's collapse, ensuring that the Union's fight was now explicitly tied to liberation. It sent a powerful message to enslaved people across the South. If they could escape, if Union troops advanced, freedom was within reach. It also eliminated any possibility of European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy. Countries like Britain and France, which had abolished slavery, now saw the war as a battle between freedom and bondage, making them reluctant to support the South. Yet, beyond its symbolism, the proclamation also had tactical significance. By declaring enslaved people free in rebel states, Lincoln hoped to destabilize the Confederate economy, encouraging mass escapes, forcing slaveholders into chaos, and weakening the South's labor force. It also opened the door for black men to officially join the Union Army, a shift that would profoundly reshape the course of the war. For centuries, black Americans had been denied the right to fight for their own freedom. But now, with emancipation as Union policy, the military could no longer reject them. Thousands of formerly enslaved men flocked to Union lines, eager to pick up arms and fight for their liberation, turning escaped slaves into soldiers, ensuring that the war for freedom was now fought by those who had suffered under bondage themselves. This led to the formation of black regiments, with the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment becoming one of the most legendary units of the war. Composed of African American soldiers, many of whom had once been enslaved, the 54th proved that black men were not only willing, but fully capable of fighting for their own liberation. Their courage, discipline, and unwavering determination shattered racist beliefs about black inferiority, proving that they deserved not only freedom, but full participation in the fight to secure it. Across battlefields, black soldiers fought fiercely, knowing that they were not just fighting for victory, but for the right to exist as free men in a country that had long denied them that dignity. The impact of black soldiers extended beyond military strategy. It reinforced the fact that slavery could not survive, that freedom was coming, and that once African Americans had taken up arms for their own liberation, the nation could never return to its past. The fight for freedom was no longer just political. It was a battle waged by those who had endured the horrors of slavery themselves, ensuring that the war's final outcome would be more than a Union victory. It would be the death of slavery itself. The arrival of black soldiers in the Union Army was a turning point. not only for the war itself, but for the broader fight for equality, justice, and dignity. From the moment Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, thousands of formerly enslaved men rushed to enlist, eager to take up arms not just in battle, but in a war that had denied them humanity for generations. Their determination was unwavering, their sacrifice unmatched, and yet, despite their commitment to the Union cause, they faced relentless discrimination, unequal treatment, and skepticism from both military leaders and white soldiers who refused to accept them as equals. But still, they marched, still, they trained, still, they fought, not just against the Confederate Army, but against the very prejudices that sought to keep them subordinate even within the ranks of those claiming to fight for their liberation. Among them, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment became one of the most legendary units of the war. Composed entirely of African American soldiers, led by white officers who believed in their cause, the 54th proved their worth on the battlefield, enduring grueling training, harsh conditions, and relentless scrutiny to become one of the most disciplined, effective fighting forces in the Union Army. Their bravery was fully realized during the assault on Fort Wagner in July 1863, a battle that would cement their place in history. Ordered to lead the charge against a heavily fortified Confederate position, the men of the 54th ran headfirst into gunfire, cannon blasts, and an almost impossible fight, knowing that victory was unlikely, but refusing to back down. Their heroism stunned the nation, showing that African American soldiers were not just capable fighters, but warriors willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of freedom. Though they suffered heavy casualties, their courage shattered racist assumptions, forcing even skeptics to acknowledge their discipline, bravery, and resilience. Yet the fight did not end on the battlefield. Black soldiers faced unequal pay, limited supplies, and constant discrimination, with the government initially paying them far less than their white counterparts. They were often given the most grueling, dangerous assignments, sent on missions that exposed them to more peril than white regiments, and frequently denied promotions, no matter how exemplary their service, and yet they refused to remain silent. The soldiers of the 54th protested against unequal wages, refusing pay until they received the same compensation as white troops, a bold act of defiance that forced the government to concede, proving that their fight extended beyond the war itself and into the broader battle for respect and dignity. Other black regiments followed their example, making it clear that they were not just fighting the Confederacy, but the entire system that had sought to keep them in chains. Across the Union Army, more than 180,000 black soldiers enlisted, making up nearly 10% of the total Union forces. A force that became essential to Union victory, turning the tide of the war. Their service was not just about strategy or manpower. It was about proving that African Americans were not just victims of oppression, but fighters, survivors, leaders. Every march, every battle, every sacrifice was a testament to their unbreakable will, a defiant rejection of the belief that they were anything less than equals. They fought not just for victory, but for dignity, knowing that when the war ended, their struggle for justice would not be over. But they had already proven beyond doubt that their place in history was unshakable. The war was never just about battlefields and military strategy. It was about recognition, respect, and a fundamental demand for dignity. Black soldiers, whether formerly enslaved or free before the war, knew they were not only fighting to end the Confederacy, but to prove their place in the future of the nation. Their participation in the war was a declaration of self-worth a refusal to be ignored, a demand for the full rights of citizenship. They fought harder because they knew that victory alone would not guarantee equality. Freedom had been promised before, in laws ignored, in constitutions that failed to include them, in declarations that spoke of liberty, but never extended it to Black Americans. The war gave them a chance to rewrite history, to ensure that never again could their humanity be denied. Yet, as the war ended, the question remained, what did freedom truly mean? The Emancipation Proclamation had freed enslaved people in rebel territories, but only Union victory could ensure it was enforced. Even after Lincoln issued the decree, millions remained enslaved, caught in a system that refused to acknowledge the end of their bondage. Texas became the final holdout, where many enslavers continued to force labor upon black people long after Confederate defeat, refusing to inform them of their freedom, ensuring that the chains of slavery stretched beyond the battlefield, beyond the law, beyond the war itself. It was not until June 19, 1865, 2 months after the Civil War had officially ended, that Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and forced the last enslavers to acknowledge the truth. This day, now recognized as Juneteenth, marked the final moment of slavery's official demise, but its legacy would not disappear overnight. Freedom, once declared, should have been immediate, absolute, unquestionable. Yet the betrayal of emancipation began the moment it was proclaimed, as Southern leaders, bitter over defeat, worked relentlessly to ensure that Black Americans would never truly enjoy the full rights of citizenship. They had lost the war, but they had not lost their grip on power, and they would use every tool at their disposal. Legal loopholes, violence, segregation, economic control, to ensure that freedom was never fully realized. The promise of liberation was tarnished by betrayal, and the fight for true equality was far from over. Freedom did not arrive overnight. For millions of enslaved people, the promise of liberty had been whispered through generations, passed from parent to child, held onto like a dream too fragile to break. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 had declared enslaved people free in Confederate-controlled territories, but this decree did not immediately translate into reality. Many slaveholders ignored it outright, refusing to relinquish their labor force, while Union forces were stretched too thin to enforce it across the South. Even after the Confederate surrender in April 1865, pockets of the Deep South continued to operate, as though slavery was still intact. And it wasn't until June 19, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, that the last enslaved people were officially informed of their freedom. His message, read aloud from General Order No. 3, was simple but profound. It announced that all enslaved individuals were now free, that the era of forced bondage had ended, that the last of those held in chains were finally released. This day became known as Juneteenth, a day of celebration, of jubilation, of relief, marking the true end of slavery in America. But freedom, though legally granted, did not come without its shadows. Juneteenth was a moment of unparalleled joy, but it was also a moment of profound uncertainty. Freedom had been won, but security, stability, and equality were still distant dreams. Many newly freed individuals had nowhere to go, no land, no money, no education, forced to navigate a world that had denied them basic human rights for centuries. Plantation owners, bitter and vengeful, often refused to acknowledge emancipation, continuing to exploit laborers through deception, intimidation, and violence. Black codes, laws designed to limit the rights of freedmen, emerged rapidly, ensuring that while slavery had been abolished on paper, racial oppression remained deeply embedded in the South's political and economic systems. Employers offered exploitative contracts, ensuring that freedmen remained in cycles of poverty, while many were outright forced into sharecropping, an arrangement that tethered them to plantations under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery itself. Celebration was overshadowed by fear, poverty, and the realization that freedom was not enough. True equality would require an entirely new struggle. For many freedmen, Juneteenth was the beginning of a long fight, not the end of it. Families searched for lost loved ones, desperately trying to reconnect after years of forced separation. Some migrated westward. Some built black communities where they could find protection, and others remained trapped in the shadows of their former enslavers, unable to break free from the suffocating grip of white supremacy. The South had lost the war, but it refused to surrender its ideology, quickly adapting through violence, legislation, and terror to maintain the racial hierarchy that had once been enforced by slavery. Juneteenth was supposed to mark the dawn of a new era, but for many, it simply revealed the next battle ahead. A fight for land, for rights, for protection, for dignity, for the chance to truly live as free people in a country that had never truly welcomed them. Juneteenth had marked the legal end of slavery in the United States, but the reality of freedom was far more complicated than a simple declaration. In the South, where the plantation economy had thrived for centuries, many former slaveholders refused to accept defeat, and newly freed black Americans found themselves trapped in an environment that was hostile, dangerous, and economically designed to keep them oppressed. The moment of celebration, when enslaved people finally learned that they were no longer legally bound to servitude, was overshadowed by the immense uncertainty of what came next. While some freedmen immediately left plantations, seeking new lives elsewhere, thousands had nowhere to go, no resources, and no way to protect themselves from the vengeful plantation owners who resented their newfound freedom. These former enslavers, stripped of their labor force, sought to recreate slavery by another name, ensuring that black Americans remained economically dependent, politically powerless, and socially subordinated. Many freedmen were forced into sharecropping, a system that kept them tied to the land they had once worked as slaves, their wages so manipulated and restricted that they could never truly accumulate wealth or escape poverty. Others faced constant racial violence, as former Confederates formed paramilitary groups and mobs dedicated to keeping black Americans in fear, ensuring that even though slavery had ended, their terror continued. Legal oppression followed quickly. Southern legislatures passed black codes, laws designed to restrict the movement, rights, and economic opportunities of freedmen, preventing them from owning land, voting, or securing stable employment without severe restrictions. The idea of full equality was never truly considered by white lawmakers, many of whom had no intention of allowing black Americans to participate fully in society. These laws functioned as a way to reassert white control, though slavery was gone. Racism remained as deeply embedded in American life as ever. The federal government attempted to step in, establishing the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency meant to help newly freed people transition into independence, providing education, food, and basic assistance. But the program was chronically underfunded and met fierce resistance from white Southerners. Former slaveholders refused to let go of their power, and despite federal attempts at reconstruction, many freedmen remained in conditions only marginally better than slavery. Yet, despite the immense struggles, the years following emancipation were also filled with hope, as black Americans seized every opportunity to build lives for themselves, establishing communities, churches, schools, and for the first time, participating in government. Reconstruction briefly opened political doors, allowing black men to vote, hold office, and influence legislation in ways that had never been possible before. Southern states, under federal oversight, elected black representatives, and for a short time, it seemed as though true change was within reach. These leaders fought for equal rights, for land ownership, for the protection of black communities, and for the restructuring of the South into a society that could truly reflect the ideals of freedom and democracy. But their success was short-lived. White Southerners, unwilling to tolerate black political power, mobilized against them with fierce opposition. And the Reconstruction era, though promising, soon collapsed under the weight of racial violence, political sabotage, and federal abandonment. The progress made during these years would not last, and the brief window where black Americans held office, voted freely, and shaped the future of the country would soon be shut by Jim Crow laws, white terror, and the systematic destruction of their newfound rights. Freedom had been granted, but true equality was still a distant dream. The Reconstruction era was a brief, fleeting moment of progress, a time when black Americans, newly freed from slavery, sought to build lives for themselves, participate in democracy, and claim the rights long denied to them. The years following the Civil War saw unprecedented changes, as formerly enslaved men, once considered property, began voting, holding office, and shaping legislation. The Union Army, stationed in the South to enforce Reconstruction policies, helped ensure that black citizens could safely exercise their new rights, leading to historic advancements. Black men were elected to Congress, state legislatures, and local government positions, marking the first time African Americans played a direct role in shaping the nation's laws and policies. Leaders like Hiram Revels, the first black U.S. senator, and Robert Smalls, a former slave-turned-congressman, became symbols of triumph, proving that freedom was not just a concept, it was something that could be fully realized. Black communities, despite overwhelming obstacles, thrived. Schools were built, businesses were started, land was purchased. Churches became centers of empowerment, and for a moment, it seemed as though justice had finally arrived. But that hope was met with violent resistance. Southern white backlash erupted with brutal force, as former slaveholders, Confederate sympathizers, and political elites refused to accept a world where black men could vote, own property, or hold power. The federal government had abolished slavery, but it had not eradicated white supremacy, and many Southern whites saw Reconstruction not as progress, but as an attack on their way of life. Their response was swift, merciless, and relentless. They used every tool available: political sabotage, intimidation, terrorism, to ensure that black success was erased. The Ku Klux Klan, originally formed as a secret fraternity, quickly evolved into a paramilitary force dedicated to undermining Reconstruction, using lynchings, arson, beatings, and assassinations to terrorize black communities. Their goal was clear: to restore white dominance through fear, ensuring that black voters, politicians, and activists would never feel safe exercising their rights. The Klan and other white supremacist groups raided homes, burned schools, attacked freedmen's families, and assassinated black leaders, sending a clear message that political participation would come at a deadly cost. Southern lawmakers, many of whom had once been Confederate officials, worked within the system to dismantle black progress, passing black codes, laws specifically designed to limit the freedoms of freedmen, ensuring that they remained economically dependent, socially inferior and politically powerless. These codes restricted movement, banned interracial marriage, criminalized unemployment, and allowed white employers to control black workers in ways eerily similar to slavery. Land ownership, once seen as a path to independence, became nearly impossible as white elites ensured that freedmen could not acquire wealth or stability. The hope of Reconstruction was slowly strangled, and as federal troops were pulled out of the South, white supremacist forces regained control, dismantling nearly every achievement black Americans had fought to secure. What had been a brief glimpse of progress became a bitter reminder that freedom alone was not enough. Without protection, without federal oversight, without true equality under the law, Reconstruction collapsed. And the South descended back into a system of racial oppression, one that would last for generations. Black Americans had been freed from slavery, but they had not been freed from white supremacy, and the war for justice was far from over. The Southern backlash against Reconstruction was swift, brutal, and calculated to erase every gain that black Americans had made since the Civil War. White supremacists, enraged by the sight of black men voting, holding office, and building independent communities, mobilized with ferocious intensity, seeking to restore their racial dominance by any means necessary. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, and other white terror groups emerged as the unofficial enforcers of white supremacy, launching a reign of terror aimed at crushing black political power, dismantling Reconstruction governments, and reinstating fear as a tool of control. The Klan targeted black leaders, community organizers, and those who dared to exercise their newfound rights. Lynchings, beatings, church burnings, and nighttime raids became common weapons, used to ensure that black Americans remained afraid to demand equality. The Klan's violence wasn't just random brutality. It was strategic, aimed at undermining every element of Reconstruction that had allowed black communities to thrive. Black voters were attacked on their way to the polls. Elected black officials were assassinated or forced out of office, and any attempt to resist was met with overwhelming force. This campaign of terror was not just tolerated, it was endorsed by many white politicians and law enforcement officials, ensuring that there was no protection for black citizens who sought justice. Meanwhile, Southern legislators worked through legal channels to destroy Reconstruction in a different way. Black codes, passed across former Confederate states, functioned as a new set of laws meant to keep black Americans subjugated, even without slavery. These laws restricted movement, criminalized unemployment, banned interracial marriage, and denied black people access to land and political power, ensuring that despite emancipation, the South's racial hierarchy remained firmly intact. The enforcement of these laws was ruthless. Black men and women who violated minor rules were often subjected to harsh punishments, jailed for offenses that white citizens would never be prosecuted for. In many cases, arrested black men were forced into labor camps, where they essentially became slaves once more, working without pay for the benefit of white landowners and businesses. The end of slavery had not ended white control. It had merely changed its form. And with this political and social oppression came economic exploitation, the final stage of Reconstruction's collapse. As black communities struggled to gain financial independence, white landowners found a way to keep them tied to the plantations. Sharecropping. This system, presented as a form of employment, was a deceptive trap designed to keep black families in cycles of debt and dependency. Landowners would lease small plots of land to black farmers, promising them a portion of the crops they harvested. But contracts were manipulated, debts fabricated, and wages stolen, ensuring that sharecroppers could never truly profit from their labor. They remained trapped, forced to continue working the same land where they had once been enslaved, barely surviving under conditions only slightly removed from slavery itself. The South had lost the war, but it had not surrendered its grip on Black Americans. It simply restructured oppression into new forms, ensuring that racial inequality persisted well beyond the Civil War and into the next century. Sharecropping was supposed to provide newly freed Black Americans with a path toward economic independence. But in reality, it became another mechanism of oppression, trapping families in a system designed to keep them permanently struggling. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Southern landowners, devastated by the loss of enslaved labor, sought ways to maintain their dominance over Black workers. Since outright slavery had been abolished, they turned to economic manipulation, crafting contracts that would tie Black farmers to the land without the ability to escape crushing debts. Sharecroppers, many of whom were formerly enslaved individuals, eager to build a future for themselves, were offered small plots of land to cultivate, with the promise that they could keep a portion of their harvest while giving the rest to the white landowner as rent. But this system was rigged from the start. Landowners controlled everything: the land, the supplies, the prices, ensuring that sharecroppers were constantly in debt, unable to save enough money to purchase their own land or break free. They had no power to negotiate prices, and when harvest time came, they were often told that they owed more than they had earned, forcing them to remain trapped in this cycle year after year. The exploitation was brutal and unrelenting. Many sharecroppers were forced to buy farming tools, seeds, and supplies from landowner-owned stores, where prices were artificially inflated, ensuring that debts were always higher than earnings. If a sharecropper had a bad season, due to weather, illness, or dishonest accounting, they had no choice but to continue working the land to pay off their debts, often passing these financial burdens down to their children. This created a system of debt peonage, a legal form of economic servitude, where Black families were forced to remain on the land indefinitely, unable to leave because they owed too much to ever repay. Some laws made it illegal to abandon the land while in debt, leading to arrests, imprisonment, and forced labor for those who tried to escape. In many ways, sharecropping functioned as a shadow system of slavery, ensuring that Black Americans remained economically shackled, denied access to ownership, and completely dependent on white landowners. The goal of this system was clear: land control meant power, and by preventing Black farmers from acquiring their own property, Southern elites ensured that racial hierarchy remained firmly intact. Even when Black sharecroppers managed to save enough to purchase land, they faced violent backlash, sabotage, and legal barriers as white communities refused to allow them to gain economic independence. Some Black landowners were forced to sell at unfair rates, while others had their farms burned, stolen, or seized through fraudulent legal schemes, ensuring that wealth never accumulated in Black communities. Over time, this led to generational poverty, where families remained trapped in financial cycles they had no means of escaping. Children were born into this system, raised in homes where survival depended on endless labor, and most had no opportunity to pursue education or careers beyond the fields. The very promise of freedom, the idea that Black Americans could build futures for themselves, was systematically dismantled, replaced by a system that ensured that while slavery had technically ended, economic bondage remained as deeply entrenched as ever. debt peonage became a new form of enslavement, one that did not rely on legal ownership, but instead trapped black families in endless cycles of financial servitude. Southern elites, unwilling to relinquish control after the abolition of slavery, crafted an economic system that ensured black workers would never accumulate enough wealth to escape their grip. The sharecropping system had already forced freedmen into dependency, but debt peonage solidified this oppression, binding entire generations to the land without opportunity for advancement. Landowners manipulated accounts, inflating costs, charging arbitrary fees, and ensuring that no matter how much labor was provided, black farmers would always owe more than they could pay. This manufactured debt became a chain, keeping families on plantations long after slavery had technically ended, ensuring that their labor continued to enrich the same people who had once held them in bondage. Land control was a crucial weapon in this oppression. White landowners ensured that black farmers remained tenant workers, prohibiting them from purchasing land, denying them loans, and even seizing property through fraud and intimidation. Those who did manage to buy land faced constant threats, arson, and destruction, as white mobs sought to erase any possibility of black economic independence. Meanwhile, in cities, black families were relegated to segregated, poorly maintained neighborhoods, denied the same financial opportunities available to white citizens. Racist zoning laws ensured that black communities remained underfunded and underserved, their schools neglected, their infrastructure failing, their businesses unable to thrive. Generational poverty took hold, with children born into families burdened by debts their parents had never been able to escape, forced into low-paying labor, denied access to proper education, and systematically blocked from climbing the economic ladder. As Reconstruction collapsed and white supremacists regained control of the South, the nation transitioned into an era of segregation, one where the chains of slavery were replaced with Jim Crow laws, a system designed to ensure that black Americans remained permanently second-class citizens. From whips to water fountains, the oppression evolved, trading the overt brutality of slavery for legalized exclusion, enforced poverty, and institutional racism that dictated where black Americans could live, work, eat, and even exist. The promise of freedom had never been fully realized. It had simply been reshaped into a different form of oppression, one that would last for generations to come. Jim Crow laws were designed to enforce a racial hierarchy that kept black Americans permanently inferior, ensuring that even after slavery's abolition, white supremacy remained deeply embedded in every aspect of society. From the 1870s through the mid-20th century, these laws segregated public spaces, denying black citizens the right to sit in the same restaurants, attend the same schools, drink from the same water fountains, or even enter certain neighborhoods as white people. Every element of daily life was dictated by segregation, meant to reinforce the idea that black people were unworthy of equal status, that their presence was tolerated only if kept at a distance. That true integration was unthinkable. The phrase, separate but equal, became the legal justification for these laws, upheld by the Supreme Court's Plessy v. Ferguson 1896 decision, which claimed that segregation was constitutional as long as black facilities were equal to white ones. But that was a lie. Black schools were poorly funded, black neighborhoods lacked infrastructure, black hospitals were inadequate, and black Americans were barred from the same opportunities afforded to whites. Jim Crow was not just about physical separation. It was about maintaining oppression, controlling access to resources, and ensuring that black Americans remained disenfranchised. This system was enforced through violence and terror. Black Americans who challenged segregation faced brutal retaliation, from economic ruin to physical assaults to execution without trial. Lynching became a widely used tool of white supremacy, a way to terrorize black communities into submission, making it clear that stepping out of line meant death. White mobs, often with the full support of law enforcement, carried out public executions of black men, women, and even children, frequently on false accusations, perceived disrespect, or mere existence in spaces deemed off-limits. Lynchings were spectacles, sometimes advertised in newspapers, sometimes carried out in daylight, attended by crowds who treated these murders as celebrations rather than atrocities. There was no accountability. Few perpetrators were ever punished, as the legal system actively protected them, ensuring that black families lived under the constant threat of being murdered without consequence. Voter suppression was another weapon of Jim Crow, ensuring that black Americans had no voice in government, stripping them of the ability to influence policies that affected their lives. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were used to block black citizens from voting, ensuring that white politicians remained in power and could continue crafting laws that preserved segregation. Black citizens who tried to register to vote faced threats, intimidation, job loss, and sometimes outright violence, making it nearly impossible to participate in democracy. The South had lost the Civil War, but it had found ways to preserve the very ideology of slavery, rebranded as systemic racism that still shaped every corner of American society. Lynching, voter suppression, and systemic racism were the tools used to maintain white supremacy long after slavery had been abolished. Lynching became a weapon of terror, a public spectacle meant to strike fear into black communities, ensuring that even though they were no longer legally enslaved, they could still be killed without consequence. White mobs, often encouraged by local officials, dragged black men, women, and even children from their homes, accusing them of fabricated crimes or simply punishing them for perceived defiance. These killings were not secret acts of violence. They were public displays, meant to reinforce the idea that black people could never truly be free. Photographs of lynchings were sold as postcards. Crowds gathered to watch and cheer, and perpetrators were rarely, if ever, held accountable. Even after Reconstruction, the federal government refused to intervene, allowing tens of thousands of black lives to be taken in the name of preserving racial hierarchy. Voter suppression ensured that black Americans remained politically powerless, blocking their ability to participate in democracy and shape the future of the nation. Southern lawmakers passed poll taxes, literacy tests, and property requirements, creating legal barriers that prevented black citizens from casting ballots. These laws were deliberately crafted to exclude black voters. And even when black men managed to meet the requirements, they faced intimidation, threats, and violence at the polls. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups patrolled election sites, terrorizing black citizens, ensuring that many never dared to vote at all. Meanwhile, gerrymandering and legislative manipulation ensured that black votes had little impact, preserving white political dominance. The right to vote had been promised, but in practice it was stripped away by fear, corruption, and systemic sabotage. Systemic racism continued to shape every aspect of American life, embedding itself into housing policies, employment discrimination, education segregation, and law enforcement practices. Black families were blocked from buying homes in white neighborhoods, denied bank loans, and pushed into impoverished communities through discriminatory policies like redlining. ensuring that wealth remained out of reach. Schools remained deeply unequal, with black children forced into underfunded, overcrowded classrooms, while white students were given access to quality education, better resources, and greater opportunities. In the workplace, black workers were denied fair wages, pushed into low-paying, unstable jobs, and shut out of industries that could offer long-term prosperity. Even law enforcement targeted black communities disproportionately, creating a criminal justice system that favored white perpetrators and punished black citizens at staggering rates. Every aspect of life was designed to ensure that true equality was never achieved, that black Americans remained trapped in a cycle of poverty, fear, and exclusion, even though slavery had officially ended. And yet, despite all of this, the way slavery and its aftermath are taught in schools is often watered down, incomplete, or outright ignored. The legacy of slavery should be a fundamental part of American history, but in many classrooms, it is treated as a footnote, a distant past that does not connect to modern realities. Textbooks soften the brutality, glossing over the horrors of lynching, voter suppression, and systemic racism, often failing to acknowledge the continued effects of these injustices today. Some states even ban discussions of race and slavery, erasing the truth entirely, ensuring that students never learn how deeply racism has shaped the nation they live in. Instead of confronting history, many schools choose to sanitize it, presenting an America that claims to have overcome its past without fully addressing the chains that still remain. The way slavery is taught in schools has long been a battleground of history and erasure, shaped by political agendas, cultural discomfort, and a persistent refusal to confront the full weight of America's past. For generations, textbooks have softened the brutality, treating slavery as a mere economic system rather than a crime against humanity. Instead of detailing the horrors of forced labor, mass executions, family separations, and generational trauma, many curriculums frame slavery as an unfortunate but necessary step in America's development, omitting the voices of the enslaved, ignoring the resistance, and failing to connect slavery's legacy to modern racial inequalities. In some states, textbooks avoid the word slavery altogether, referring to enslaved people as workers, or claiming that slavery was a mutually beneficial system, dismissing the violence and suffering that defined it. The deeper reality is often intentionally erased. Schools rarely discuss how slavery built America's wealth, how northern industries profited, how universities were funded by slave labor, or how policies crafted in slavery's aftermath continue to shape black communities today. Instead, the focus is often on abstract discussions of the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and political compromises, presenting history through the lens of those in power rather than those who suffered under it. Lessons on Reconstruction, if taught at all, are often framed as a failure due to corruption and incompetence, rather than as a violent effort by white supremacists to crush black political gains. Discussions of the Civil War still entertain the false idea that it was fought over states' rights, deliberately avoiding the undeniable truth that slavery was the core cause. Even when slavery is taught properly, it is often treated as a distant past, with little connection to today's racial disparities. Students learn about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, but not about redlining, mass incarceration, or how systemic racism remains a direct continuation of slavery's legacy. The discomfort around these discussions has led many states to actively restrict the teaching of race and history, passing laws that ban divisive topics or prevent educators from explaining how racism functions in institutions. These restrictions ensure that the full truth is never acknowledged, allowing generations to grow up believing that slavery was a tragic but resolved chapter in history, rather than a foundation upon which racial inequality continues to be built. Meanwhile, the debate over statues vs. stories highlights the broader conflict between memory and mythology. Statues of Confederate generals, slaveholders, and segregationists still stand across the country, glorifying men who fought to keep black people in bondage. While textbooks fail to include the voices of the enslaved or the full brutality of their suffering, the monuments tell one version of history, but the real stories, the narratives of enslaved resistance, black triumph, and the long fight for justice, are often buried, ignored, or distorted. America has spent decades preserving the memory of its oppressors, while erasing the history of those they oppressed, ensuring that the past is remembered not as it was, but as those in power wish it to be. Statues tell one story, but history tells another. Across the United States, monuments honoring Confederate generals, slave owners, and segregationists still stand, towering over courthouses, public parks, and city centers, serving as constant reminders of the nation's refusal to fully reckon with its past. These figures, immortalized in bronze and stone, represent those who fought to preserve slavery, yet for decades, they have been framed as symbols of Southern heritage, as if their legacies were separate from the brutal system of oppression they defended. Meanwhile, the stories of the enslaved, their resistance, their survival, their triumphs, remain marginalized, often left out of textbooks, ignored in public discourse, and erased from mainstream narratives. Statues glorify the oppressors, while stories, if told truthfully, reveal the voices of those they brutalized. And for many, this distortion of memory is not an accident. It is a deliberate attempt to shape history in a way that softens the reality of American racism, ensuring that the legacy of slavery is sanitized rather than confronted. The removal of Confederate statues in recent years has sparked intense debate, with defenders claiming that such monuments are essential to preserving history, even though they were largely erected decades after the Civil War, during periods of heightened racial tension, specifically to intimidate black communities. Their presence has never been neutral. They were meant to reinforce white dominance, standing as markers of power rather than reflections of historical accuracy. Yet, even as some are torn down, the true stories of slavery, the voices of the people who lived through it, remain underrepresented, overshadowed by myths that serve those who benefited from oppression. Education systems still struggle to teach slavery in a way that connects past injustices to present inequalities, and many politicians actively seek to restrict discussions of race in classrooms, arguing that acknowledging systemic racism is divisive. But history is not simply an argument over memory, it is a battle over truth. And that truth stretches far beyond the statues themselves. The legacy of slavery has left a long shadow, manifesting in the mass incarceration of black Americans, persistent economic inequality, and generational trauma that continues to shape lives today. The chains may no longer be visible, but their impact remains undeniable. In prisons filled disproportionately with black men, in wealth gaps that trace back to denied land ownership, in families carrying centuries of violence and exclusion. Slavery was abolished, but the structures it created never fully disappeared. They simply evolved, and the battle for justice is far from over. The echoes of slavery never truly faded, they merely transformed, embedding themselves into America's legal system, economic structures, and societal norms. The chains that once bound black bodies in fields gave way to bars, systemic exclusions, and policies designed to maintain racial hierarchy, ensuring that even after emancipation, Black Americans remained disproportionately targeted, disadvantaged, and controlled. Mass incarceration became one of the clearest continuations of this legacy, as laws and policing practices increasingly criminalized Black existence, leading to the explosion of prison populations filled overwhelmingly with Black men. The war on drugs, mandatory minimum sentences, and discriminatory policing turned entire communities into battlegrounds, reinforcing racial stereotypes that painted Black Americans as criminals rather than citizens. The prison system became an engine of modern servitude, with inmates, many imprisoned for non-violent offenses, forced into unpaid or barely compensated labor, echoing the exploitation of slavery. Economic inequality remains another undeniable relic of America's enslaved past. Black families were systematically denied the ability to accumulate wealth, with generations losing land through legal manipulation, redlining, and discriminatory banking practices. Even today, Black households hold a fraction of the wealth of their white counterparts, a gap that directly stems from the denial of homeownership, access to higher paying jobs, and persistent wage disparities. Education systems continue to favor white communities, with Black schools receiving less funding, fewer resources, and harsher disciplinary policies, ensuring that opportunities for advancement remain limited. Beyond policy, generational trauma lingers, passed down through histories of violence, displacement, and systemic oppression. The psychological scars of slavery, the forced separation of families, the brutalization of Black bodies, the denial of human dignity, manifest in modern struggles against racism, racial profiling, and institutional bias. Every unjust imprisonment, every lost opportunity, every denial of basic rights feeds into the same cycle that began centuries ago, proving that while the legal framework of slavery may have been abolished, its impact continues to shape Black lives in ways that cannot be ignored. Because the truth is clear, slavery didn't end. It evolved. Slavery did not vanish. It transformed, shifting its shape, embedding itself into systems, policies, and cycles of oppression designed to keep Black Americans from ever truly being free. The end of legal slavery was not the end of servitude. It merely opened the door for new forms of control, new ways to ensure that racial hierarchy remained intact. First came Black codes, then came Jim Crow, and then came the modern prison industrial complex, built on laws that disproportionately target, convict, and imprison Black individuals, forcing them into labor under the guise of justice. The wealth stolen during slavery was never returned. The opportunities denied during Reconstruction were never restored. The scars left by generations of forced labor, family separations, and brutal violence did not fade. They shaped communities, built histories of poverty, created structural barriers that still stand today. Housing discrimination, voter suppression, mass incarceration, wage disparities, education gaps. These are not coincidences. They are the evolved mechanisms of oppression, ensuring that while slavery itself may have ended, its weight still crushes Black communities under generations of systemic racism. It is in the neighborhoods where families are locked into cycles of poverty. It is in the courtroom where sentencing disproportionately falls on Black defendants. It is in the history books that erase the full truth, in the monuments that glorify the men who fought to keep others in chains. The shackles may no longer be visible, but they are still felt, still enforced, still deeply woven into the fabric of America. Slavery didn't end. It evolved. A small disclaimer before we close. We have made every effort to ensure historical accuracy in this narration. but history is vast, complex, and filled with details that sometimes shift with new discoveries. There may always be room for correction, but the story remains undeniable, powerful, and worth remembering. Now, it's time to rest, to let your mind find peace in the quiet, to drift into sleep, knowing that history continues, but so does hope. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the night take you gently. Tomorrow is a new day, and the world will still be here, waiting for you.